Welcome to the final Calumet Revisited Forum of this school year. I am Michael Bowes of the Association for the Wolf Lake Initiative. I am a co-host with Dr. Valerie Henneman of Calumet College. And Calumet Revisited is funded in part by the Indiana Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Before we hear from tonight's speaker, are there any announcements? If not, I have one. Ollie's Calumet Nature Exchange meets via Zoom Tuesday, May 16th at 7 p.m. It will feature Laura Barkhusen, UWA's director at Open Land. She will provide an update on her work with partners along the Little Calumet River in Beaubien Woods and the neighborhoods west of Beaubien Woods. They seek to protect and restore open space and raise awareness of the significant history of the area. Remember, licensed teachers in Indiana can earn an hour of professional development credit by participating.
Yeah.
I had it. Just out, have everyone come in on 147.
The presentation this evening is being recorded. The recording will be available within a week on Ollie's website. Would everyone please remain on mute? After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Please, everyone, remain on mute. Tonight, we will hear from Alan Resetar, formerly of the Field Museum, and he'll be talking about his favorite amphibians and reptiles of the Calumet region. Alan?
Okay, well, thanks for inviting me, Michael. And thank you for everything you've done for Wolf Lake over the decades. Really, it's my favorite lake in Indiana. And I appreciate it, everything you've done.
Yes,
so I'm gonna.
Alan, I missed the cricket frogs. They're no longer
yeah.
there.
I know. I've got to get out there this year. There's a big initiative to study the cricket frog this year. A person at the Shed Aquarium is kind of running the initiative. So I definitely want to get out and see, if what happened there, because the cricket frog, what we thought was pretty much gone from the Wolf Lake area. And then after a bio blitz, I think in 2001, my wife and I were canoeing around and we stopped at Strawberry Island and there were cricket frogs jumping around all over. And we heard them, after that for a number of years, and Michael has too. And then they seem to have disappeared. And what's interesting about the cricket frog is you can simulate them to call with a clicker. Either one of those little novelty clickers, that kids used to have in the 50s and 60s, or a dog training clicker that you use, to train your dog. And if you click those, the cricket frogs, during the proper season will respond to them. But after a few years at Wolf Lake, at the spot we knew the cricket frogs were at, they weren't responding. We realized that they probably, something happened. So, after that, they had done the restoration work at Wolf Lake. So maybe the cricket frogs just moved to one of the restored areas. But we need to definitely get out there and, figure out what's going on. at least for Michael's sake anyway. I know he's worried about them, and so am I. Well, I'll try to get through this in an hour, and then we'll have questions afterwards. So as everyone knows, who lives in the Calumet area, we're a kind of a post-industrial landscape, but fortunately there are lots of natural areas, even though they might be disturbed like Wolf Lake, they still are capable of harboring amphibians and reptiles and lots of other wildlife and plants too. So why are the Calumet region and its resident amphibians and reptiles interesting? Well, first define the Calumet region. Now, different people define the Calumet in different ways. I include all of the area within the dashed lines, which includes a part of Illinois, as you can see, and then it goes fairly far south in Indiana, and then goes all the way up to the Michigan line in LaPorte County. Now, to other people, the Calumet is much smaller. It's just the southeast side of Chicago and part of Lake County. So it covers it has two watersheds within it, the Calumet, which we all know about, and then the Galene River watershed, which is more of a Michigan river. And the area is 811 square miles and is in 2 states and covers parts of 4 counties, one of which is Cook County in Illinois. So we've got the Indiana Dunes National Park, which is a key natural feature in our area. And it's a fragmented, as we all know. You can see the little green patches, spread over 3 counties. And the total square mileage of the areas is 24. So it's not a huge national park as national parks go, but it's still very significant. And the glaciers did a lot of the landscape work around the Calumet region. The Pleistocene glaciation, which ended maybe about 9,000–10,000 years ago, contributed to the different landforms we see, the dunes, the moraines, the wetland areas. And then after the glaciers left, the climate started to fluctuate. So we had warm, wet periods, and then we also had dry, cold periods. And during those periods, plants and animals that were adapted to those conditions were able to migrate into the area. And after the climate kind of stabilized as it is now, some of those species were able to hang on in special areas, even though the majority of the habitat in the area were not conducive to those particular species. And we've got a very interesting geology. The illustration here shows the dune and swale, or the strand plain. If you've ever been out to Gibson Woods,
the vines, they still believe it's a big disaster. Now look, jump on it.
Oh, what was that? But the parallel beach ridges occur at Gibson Woods Nature Preserve in Hammond. And if you've ever been out there hiking around, you know that you'll walk up a little dune, and then you'll walk through a wetland, and then you go up over another dune. And that feature was actually pretty widely distributed in the Calumet region. As you can see in this illustration, there used to be close to 100 parallel beach ridges left in the Gary Hammond area. And these actually extended into the Calumet City, and then I think even into parts of Chicago. I think there's a little bit of dune and swale still left up in Lincoln Park near the zoo. And then the dune and swale, kind of its eastern edge was just around the Porter Lake County line. And then we had the Calumet Lake Plain, which is just a broad, flat area. And then I already talked about the Dune and Swale or the Tolliston Strand Plain. And then further east into Porter, extreme eastern Lake County and Porter County, we have the high coastal sand dunes, which kind of replace the Dune and Swale. And then we have both Calumet rivers, the Grand Calumet and the Little Calumet. And then there's a continental divide in our area that separates the Mississippi and the Great Lakes watersheds. And then anyone who spent a little bit of time gardening or hiking around or just observing in general, you know, we've got a wide variety of soil types, anything from a clay or silt loam to sandy soil and everything in between. And what's really interesting about the Calumet region is that we are the ecotone, or the boundary between the eastern deciduous forest and the tallgrass prairie. And you can see in Illinois and just a little bit of Indiana where the green shading is, that is the tallgrass prairie. And then everything east of there in Indiana, except for little pockets of prairie that actually even occur in Ohio, are you know, the eastern deciduous forest. So it seems like the boundary line between the two biomes is almost at the Indiana-Illinois state line, and we can see that in the distribution or the occurrences of certain amphibian and reptile species, where the more you have more prairie species on the Illinois side, and then over on the Indiana side, you have more of the eastern deciduous forest species of amphibians and reptiles. And of course, the same occurs with plants and mammals and insects and such. So we're really in kind of a neat area that we have the flora and fauna from both of those biomes, you know, right in our own backyards here. And then we have a lot of different habitats. You know, we have a number of different wetland types. The vernal or temporary wetlands are wetlands that only have water in them until maybe June or July. And these are important amphibian breeding areas because fish cannot survive in them. And a number of amphibian species are susceptible to predation by fish, you know, especially fish eating the larvae or the eggs of the frogs and salamanders. But as long as the vernal wetland dries every year, the fish stay away, and they're ideal amphibian breeding sites. And then we have many different kinds and sizes of lakes, you know, some even artificially made. Rivers, you know, we've got the Grand Calumet, the Little Calumet, Deep River, you know, the Galene River system further east. And then we have wet areas that are very open and filled with sedges, which are grass-like plants, and they're very open. And then we have marshes, you know, which tend to be more, we can tend to think of those more as like cattail-filled marshes. Panay are those, or pans are those flat, open water areas that you see at West Beach. It's kind of a rare wetland habitat in the area, but those are very special wetlands and very interesting. And from what I was told, they stay at the same, since they're close to Lake Michigan, the level in those actually follows the level of the lake water in Lake Michigan. And then we have bogs, which tend to have acidic waters. And then we have a fen, which is very similar to a bog, a very open habitat without a lot of trees, but it has a lot of springs coming up. And the water there tends to be more basic or alkaline. And then along the lakeshore, we've got different dune communities. You know, we've got the beach, which is disturbed quite a bit by wind and waves coming in. but there are still animal species and plant species that specialize in those harsh habitats. Then we have the open dunes, which are only covered with marram grass and maybe some cottonwoods and some shrubs. And then we have the more mature dunes further inland that are forest covered. And then we have a lot of different terrestrial habitats. We've already talked a little bit about the prairie, and then we have forested areas. And then we have a kind of a hybrid between the two, which is the oak savanna, which has very widely placed trees with prairie vegetation growing underneath them. And then we have what we call the anthropogenic or man-altered habitats. And if you look down at the bottom right, that's an area in Porter County, right near ArcelorMittal. And what those reddish humps of soil are something called filter cake. And the mill filters precipitates and solids out of the wastewater before it goes back into Lake Michigan. And then they would take it over to this site on the other side of Highway 12 and then dump it. So it's a whole area that's totally comprised of non-native soils, except for what the insects, the burrowing insects and other animals bring up. They will bring up sand from underneath. But it's still, believe it or not, a very rich habitat for amphibians and reptiles and dragonflies and butterflies. It's kind of a very strange place, but very interesting nonetheless. And I think it's now part of the National Lakeshore, if I'm not mistaken. And then, the Calumet is kind of a showcase of things that should not be done to the environment. We've covered almost a quarter of the wetlands in the Calumet region with artificial fill. That could be cinders and slag from the steel mills, land dug up from other places and, moved into wetlands to fill them so that you could build something on the solid land that's now in place of the wetlands. Landfills are, another a big feature of the area where artificial substances have covered the native soils. And then we've had massive drainage projects. Like the middle photo is actually the Grand Calumet River. And that's how it was channelized right near US Steel, which you can kind of see on the right of the photo. This particular area is now of the river is now actually in a tunnel. So it doesn't even see the light of day anymore. And then our soil and aquatic sediments are repositories of discharges from the past. I was doing some survey work in the Grand Calumet River right around Hammond and East Chicago, Gary. And believe it or not, there's actually quite a bit of life in the Grand Calumet River. In the 1970s, we considered, or the early 70s, and we considered the river dead. The only thing that was living in there was some sort of invertebrate, maggot-like creature that was very tolerant of pollution. But nowadays, believe it or not, there's beavers, there's a couple of species of frogs, there's water snakes, turtles. It's really, a very interesting place if you go near it. And it's actually very clean. Most of the water in the Grand Calumet River is artificially derived. It's, there are no tributaries that feed into the river. So most of the water is industrial discharge from the sewer plants of East Chicago, Gary, and Hammond, runoff, from hard surfaces along the river. But the sediment is still in pretty bad shape. I was doing some dip netting for frogs or whatever, and I dipped the net into the mud, at the right at the shore of, or right at the side of the river. I was, standing on the bank and then just dipping. And when I picked the dip net up out of the water, it had mud on it from the bottom of the river, and it smelled just like fuel oil. I couldn't believe it. And as those of you that live in Hammond and East Chicago know that I think it's IDEM, in Indiana Department of Environmental Management, has actually been laying geotextile material on the bottom of the river to kind of isolate the sediment from the water column of the river. And because of the oil refineries, there are almost 17 million gallons of petroleum products floating on the groundwater. Well, back in the old days, when gasoline wasn't worth a lot of money, unlike now, apparently the refineries just did not had very leaky bottoms on the fuel storage tanks, and some of that gasoline would just percolate down into the soil and into the water, above the groundwater table. My dad grew up in Whiting, and he said that they used to go to George Lake, which is just across the street from Wolf Lake, and with pans, and they used to because gasoline is lighter than water, they would take pans and they would be able to pan off gasoline that was sitting on top of the water in George Lake, and then put that in their gas tanks and use it as a source of free fuel. And then we still have atmospheric and aquatic pollution going on, much reduced from what it was, in the earlier, in the 20th century. And then we've had artificial watershed diversion, where the Great Lakes of water is actually flowing to the Mississippi instead of the Great Lakes as it had been prior to the diversion. And then other environmental issues include invasive species and predators. Invasive species can be plants and animals. On the right, you can see that tall reed-like plant, which is called Phragmites. And that just seems to be taking over wetlands like crazy the last 20 or so years in Northwest Indiana. What used to be nice cattail marshes, and the cattail marshes sometimes are, not natural either, but they're more natural than Phragmites. But the cattail marshes have been taken over by Phragmites, and this stuff grows like 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe more. It's just terrible what it's doing to, damp areas of damp soil throughout the region. And then we have invasive fish like the carp, zebra mussel, we can all name probably a dozen invasive species. And then we have suburban sprawl, more and more of the area is getting taken up by housing developments or, similar development. And then as the development goes on, areas become fragmented. So, I mean, we would prefer to have natural areas connected to one another so wildlife can move back and forth. But unfortunately, that's getting more difficult. The only place that might be occurring is along river corridors like the Little Calumet River. And this is kind of a classic picture of habitat fragmentation. This is the area just north of the Gary Airport, which you can kind of see at the aerial photo labeled as current. You can see the Gary Airport way down in the bottom corner. But in the 1938 photo, you can see the different dune and swale ridges. that start at Lake Michigan and work inward. And you can see in the current photo how fragmented that area is now. Plus, you will also notice that the lakeshore has been extended by the steel mills dumping slag into Lake Michigan. So they've actually been creating more land so that there isn't the natural beach that was there at one time is has been covered up. Okay, now how do you find amphibians and reptiles? The easiest way is just to walk around and look for them in natural areas. If you find cover items like boards or car hoods or pieces of scrap plywood, you flip those over, and many times you'll find amphibians and reptiles and other animals are taking shelter underneath. Now, if you want to get more elaborate, you can use various trapping methods. Now, before you do any surveying for amphibians and reptiles, or any state fauna in general, you need a state collecting permit, which is called the scientific purposes license, and you have to have that, which is issued by the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, before you can actually go out and survey animals. And then if you're usually the sites that you're going to are part of various jurisdictions. They might be county parks, they might be the Dunes National Park, might be Indiana State Park, they might be the Indiana State Nature Preserves, could be city parks in Hammond, Chicago, Gary, all of those various areas, have at least some species of amphibians and reptiles. And if you want to do a complete survey, you have to seek permission from all of the land managers of those sites. And most of the time, they are very happy to have you look for amphibians and reptiles, because they learn about the inhabitants of the land that they manage. So as I talked about earlier, you just walk around and look. You don't have to wear waders like this fella's doing. You can just have your tennis shoes on and walk around, get wet. And then you can use minnow trap to live trap in water. When you're setting a minnow trap, you want to make sure that part of the trap is above water. You don't want to drown any animals that any air-breathing animals like frogs and salamanders, turtles and snakes that might get in here. And you have to be very careful if rain is coming, because sometimes these wetlands will fill up to the point where they will actually cover the top of the trap. So some people even put like styrofoam floats on their minnow traps. So as the water rises, the trap itself will float, so that a little bit of it is above water, so entrapped animals can breathe. And then you can you can just set one in a wetland, or you can put a whole array of them in. If you want to sample all, the whole perimeter of a wetland. So it just, up to the person doing the surveys and how extensive they want to be, and how much time they have to do all the setting and checking. And you don't want traps to go a long time. You want to ideally check them maybe every 12 hours. Okay, dip netting is one way of sampling shallow wetlands, and it's a pretty effective technique. You get a lot of things: insects, spiders, amphibians and reptiles, fish. Just about anything that's in the water, you'll eventually dredge up with your net. And then learning to recognize the frog calls is critical, but it's very easy. There aren't a lot of species, that call in our area, and the calls of each one, in most cases, are very distinctive from one another. So it's and there's CDs and websites, that you can, utilize to learn the calls pretty easily. And then another way is to get a nice car like this one here, and then just drive the roads. It's there are certain times of year when it's better. In early spring, you can drive the roads adjacent to wetlands. This could be in late February, March, watching for migrations of salamanders to breeding ponds. The Indian summertime of fall, when after you've had maybe a frost or cool weather, but then the weather turns windy and sunny again. Those are wonderful days for getting your favorite car out on the road and just driving around looking for amphibians and reptiles. And most of them are, if they're feeding to get ready for hibernation, or they're actually moving to their hibernation sites. So there's a lot of activity going on at that particular time. And you want to, if you do road surveys, you want to do them during the day and also at night too. And then if you have access to a canoe or a rowboat or small motorboat, that's another effective way to do surveys. And then a method that takes a little more planning and permission and work is to use drift fence. A drift fence is just a piece of aluminum flashing. It can be anywhere from 15 to 30 or 40 feet long. And what you do is take a shovel and you dig a little bit of a trench in the soil. And then you put the bottom 2 inches of the aluminum flashing down into that soil. And then you kind of push it back together to hold the fence, and maybe use some sticks to prop up the fence. And then at each end, you put a live catch trap, which is usually a screen funnel trap, but it could be a buried 5-gallon bucket. Some people are actually using buckets with cameras now, with game cameras. So, you don't even need to catch the animals. You can just, as they're moving towards the end of the fence, which is usually what they do, move from one end to the other, although they sometimes will try to go under or over, or they will come up to the fence and just go back, turn around and go back to where they came. But enough of them will follow the fence to its end that if you have the trap or the camera outfit to take their photographs, you can get a nice snapshot of what's living in that particular wetland. And it doesn't have to be a wetland either. This could be done in the middle of a forest, although that's a little harder because of all the tree roots. And in some areas like the national park, you have to get permission to do this because they do not want the soil disturbed, so that you don't possibly damage an archaeological site. So before you do something like this in the national park, there has to be a survey done to make sure you're not going to be damaging anything with your 2 or 3 inch deep trench. And then some people have trained dogs to find turtles, salamanders. People even use them to find marine mammals. You put the dog on a boat and it cruise around in the boat until it smells, a whale or whatever. But some dogs, are pretty easy to train to look for particularly box turtles. Okay, so once you find an animal, that's maybe a third of the effort. Now, once you have it, you want to identify it. You want to record the location. It's easy now. We have GPS systems. Back in the old days, you had to use topo maps. You want to record the habitat and microhabitat, date, time. You can measure the animals. Many amphibians, well, many amphibians are difficult to sex externally, but reptiles are easier. So it is possible to sex them. And then you want to take other notes on the animals, you know, if that maybe they have ticks on them, you'll make a record of that. You want to characterize the habitat by describing the plant species that might be within like 7 or 8 feet of where you found the animal. And then you want to record your method of capture, possibly take a photograph. Sometimes we mark the animals with a salamander or frog. You can carefully remove a toe. Doesn't hurt the animal at all. But if you catch that animal again, if you're studying that site, you know, over an extended period, you know you don't want to add that particular one to the total because you've already counted it. And then with snakes too, they have scales underneath the tail called subcaudals, and you can use a fingernail clipper to clip the ends of the scales. And you can actually, there's actually a coding system where you can give each snake a code. So if you catch it again, you know the exact, you know if it's an exact individual that you captured previously. And then eventually you take all that data and enter it into a computer spreadsheet or database, and then you can kind of manipulate it and use GIS, you know, to plot the occurrences of, you know, say a certain species you might be interested in. So thankfully, technology has kind of, you know, added a lot more value to this sort of data collection. And then one thing we have to be concerned about now is field hygiene. And that doesn't mean that I take a shower or bath or something before I go out in the field. It's field hygiene is sterilizing any equipment or articles of clothing that you use when going from one site to another. You don't want to carry disease, etc., from one site to another. The best thing to use is diluted bleach solution, and you use a spray bottle like this one here with a certain dilution of bleach to bleach the bottom of your canoe, your waders, your minnow traps, as you can see here. Anything that is moved from one site to the other has to be sterilized. And that's a condition of your Indiana Scientific Purposes permit. And the reason we do field hygiene is because of all these various things that we don't want to move from one site to the other. Like ranaviruses can affect turtles. Chytrid fungus is frog related. It's the fungus that we've been hearing about for the last 30 years that is destroying frog populations. Viral hemorrhagic septicemia is something that can be passed among fishes. Blue-green algae, duckweed, Phragmites, milfoil are just plants that we don't want to move from one site to the other. Mosquito fish eggs are not good things to move around, you know, especially to a pond that doesn't have fish in it already, because fish are, as I mentioned earlier, are predators of amphibian eggs and larvae. Okay, so now we'll talk about the amphibians and reptiles of the Calumet. We've got 14 species, 19 of those are amphibians, 11 are frogs and toads, 8 are salamanders, and we have 29 reptiles, 17 snakes, 9 turtles, and 3 lizards. So the Calumet, if you consider the wider definition of the Calumet River, of the Calumet region, we can add 1 additional snakes. And there are 5 endangered species that occur in our area and 6 special concern species. So we've got a pretty decent herpetofauna for a temperate area in the northern US that has severe winters. And this is just a graph showing the size, the number of species, which is the line on the vertical line, and then the area in square miles along the bottom, the horizontal line. And you can see how the first dot near the species line is the number of species in the Indiana Dunes area. And then if you just kind of follow that to the right, as you move to the right, the number of square miles increases quite a bit. But you can see the number of species in those particular areas, even though they're much bigger than the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, they don't have that many more species. So it just shows that we live in a very rich area as far as amphibians and reptiles. And the same holds true for plants and other animals too. And a lot of it is due to that the occurrence of the eastern deciduous forest right next to the western prairies, because we have inhabitants of both of those biomes occurring, right next to each other. So we've got, again, just kind of getting back on that same theme, a small area, but a high number of species or species richness. There are 59 species within that area encircled by the red line. But there are 48 species in that little blue bar at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, which is the Indiana Dunes. So the Indiana Dunes has 81% of the number of species in less than 1% of that whole area that's outlined in red. So that's pretty amazing. And then we have what I call herpetological highlights. We have some rare species in the Calumet region that aren't found in the greater in the Chicago area, which is considered southeast Wisconsin, northeast Illinois, northwest Indiana, and southwest of Michigan. So we're lucky that we have the Blanchard's cricket frog in a fair number of populations. And that was a species that disappeared in the 1960s and 70s. Previous to that, it was very common. And then we have animals that have different genotypes, like the polyploid salamanders, and I'll talk about those later. And then we have color phase differences, like our hognose snake can either be in a spotted phase or it can be in an all-black phase. And then the eastern garter snake can be in a dark or melanistic phase, or it can be in the typical striped form. And then we've had a rich history of people that have studied amphibians and reptiles. Our first observations were by the great historian of Lake County, Mr. T.H. Ball, who was recording information on the frogs as early as 1858. And then scientists started investigating our amphibians and reptiles in the late 1890s. And then one way of making a permanent record of an animal occurring in a specific area is to collect it, humanely euthanize it, and then preserve it, and then deposit it in a museum collection. And so that I mean, somebody can write a guide and mention that a certain salamander was found in Hammond, Indiana in 1897, which is okay, but you are depending on the identification skills of the person that wrote that. But if you collect a specimen and deposit, or if that person would collect a specimen and deposit in a museum, that's like the gold standard of identification. You've got the actual animal and all the information regarding it. So there are 29 North American institutions, museums, college collections that have preserved amphibians and reptiles from the Calumet. And then when I do that data collection that I talked about earlier, I mark down the habitat types. And then this just, so I analyze some of that data. And then this just kind of shows you the number of species that I have found in particular habitats in the Calumet region. Okay, and now we'll take a quick run through the amphibians and reptiles of the Calumet region. The eastern redback salamander is an eastern deciduous forest species. In Cook County, Illinois, which, as you know, we've been talking about, which is a prairie area, the redback salamander is only found at one site in Cook County. It's not found at all in Will County, Illinois. Lake County, Indiana, which is, you start getting into a little bit of the eastern deciduous forest flora and fauna. Oh, there might be 6 or 7 spots within the county. But as soon as you get over the border into Porter County and the Indiana dunes, these redback salamanders are everywhere. Well, almost everywhere in a wooded environment. They're just a super common animal. I mean, they're in some woodlands, they're the most common vertebrate animal. But they, I mean, there have been times where I've just sat down in a forest and just started going through the leaves that were on the damp leaves that were on the ground. And within minutes, I was finding redback salamanders. They're just that common. Now they occur in 2 phases. This is the redback phase. And then we also have the leadback phase. And the clutch of eggs laid by the same female will have both the leadback and the redback within, you know, within the salamanders that hatch from the eggs. And then the slimy salamander is only found at one site in the Calumet region, and there's an old record from the Indiana Dunes State Park. Typical habitat for this animal would be Turkey Run State Park, as many of us have probably been there. You know, really nice forested areas, you know. But if you go a little further east, near Walkerton, Indiana, you start getting into more populations of the slimy salamander. Okay, this is the four-toed salamander. Most of our salamanders, except the four-toed and the mud puppy, have 5 toes on their hind feet. So these are pretty easy to distinguish. But these were formerly thought to be very rare in Indiana. And then 2 biologists went out and went to all the historic localities, where there were either written record or museum specimen records for the four-toed salamanders. And they found these at all of those old sites and new ones. So based on their work, they determined that this really didn't need to be a state endangered species, so it was delisted. So that it's kind of a nice story when usually we're thinking of species declining, and here's one that seems to be holding its own. And then the blue spotted salamander. This is one of our more common salamanders in Lake and Porter County. There's even disturbed areas, like there's some woodlands down at the end of Calumet Avenue and 141st Street in Hammond, and these guys are there. There's that little Amico, well, it used to be called the Amico Preserve in, I think it's in North Hammond. And these things are just extremely common there. You can turn over a piece of railroad tie or something and find 7 or 8 of these under one railroad tie. So they're quite tolerant of disturbance, as long as the area still remains somewhat wooded. And then this is one of the polyploid salamanders. These are pretty rare in the Calumet region. But they're similar to the blue spotted I just showed you, except they grow much bigger much longer. And they are only known from female populations. There are no males of this particular form, but the females are still able to breed and produce young. And this is an eastern deciduous forest species. There's only one place on the extreme eastern side of Lake County where there's one population of these found. But as you get into Porter County and the more wooded areas, they're more common. And then this is the tiger salamander, pretty common. These guys get up to maybe 11 inches long, but they spend a lot of their time in underground burrows, but they're pretty not especially picky about the habitats. You'll find them in wooded areas and open prairie areas too. And this is the marbled salamander, characterized by the hourglasses, light-colored hourglasses on its back. These have only been found in LaPorte County at one site, and then there used to be a population in the Indiana Dunes State Park. And but unfortunately, nobody has found these within the last like 50 years, and a lot of people have looked for them. And then this is the mud puppy, and Michael Booz can tell you all about this. He was instrumental in helping students who were studying the mud puppies in Wolf Lake. And these are aquatic salamanders. They spend all of their time in the water. You can see their red gills, which is what they use to breathe underwater. And they're found, common in Wolf Lake, and then they're also found in Lake Michigan too, and then in some of our bigger rivers. Really nice animal. They get up to about 18 inches long, and they're active in the wintertime. I've talked to fishermen on Wolf Lake who catch these through the holes in the ice when they're ice fishing. And then we have the eastern newt. Again, fairly common in the dune and swale areas, but they also live in oak savanna and more wooded areas too. Okay, now we're getting into the toads, frogs and toads are just a specific family of frogs. So we've got two toads, the American toad, which is pretty common throughout the Calumet region. They even occur, in neighborhoods as long as there's some sort of a small breeding pond where they can still, still meet each other and mate. We have them in our backyard, and we live in the middle of town in Valpo. These occur in Harrison Park in Hammond. The Dowling Park and on Kennedy Avenue. So they seem to be able to hang on pretty well. And then the Fowler's toad is much more specialized. It lives in open sandy areas near Lake Michigan. So the Indiana Dunes State Park, West Beach are good places to look for these. And then the great tree frog is pretty widely distributed. You can see that it has expanded toe discs that have an adhesive component to them. So they can actually climb up cattails like you see here, but they can also climb up glass. We were at the Valparaiso University Library once, and we were on the third floor, and there was a gray tree frog on the outside of the glass, just kind of wandering around on the side of the building. The spring peeper is is usually like some more wooded areas, but they are the frogs they grow about an inch long, but they are the ones that make the peeping sounds in the spring. And some people say that hearing a chorus of these from a distance sound like sleigh bells. Now they have a characteristic marking on their back, which is an X, and you can see very well on this frog. And that's why it was named Pseudacris crucifer, crucifer meaning cross or crucifix. And then this is the western chorus frog. This is found pretty much throughout the Calumet region. You can hear these quite frequently in the spring. They're about 1 inch long, and they make the call that sounds like you're running your fingernail down the teeth of a comb. And then this is the Blanchard's cricket frog. This was very common throughout the northern Great Lakes, including the Calumet region, up until the 1960s or 70s, when they kind of mysteriously disappeared. So we're still not exactly sure why they disappeared. I mean, they're only like a 1 inch long frog. An interesting thing about them, at least in some geographic areas, is that they only live 1 year. So in August, well, let's say starting just about this time of year, once it warms up really well, they'll start mating. They'll lay their eggs maybe in July. Those will hatch into tadpoles, and then they'll metamorphose into little frogs in September. And then the adults apparently die, but the young frogs that were born that summer will overwinter, and they are the ones that will breed in the next year. So you can see for a frog that's basically an annual, that environmental problems, could be one of the keys to figuring out, why it has disappeared in certain areas. But this is the focus starting this year of surveys going on in the upper Midwest to see, see how they've done in the last 30 years. This is the American bullfrog. They're not, I mean, they're common in some areas. I think I spent, maybe 15, 20 years in the dunes, surveying amphibians and reptiles before I found my first bullfrog. So in some areas, like some wetlands or ponds in Cook County, gosh, you can just see dozens or 100 of them in a pond, just sitting there, with their eyes above the surface of the water. But at least up in the Indiana dunes, they were pretty rare. But there are other places, like down around Valparaiso, they become more common. And then this is a green frog, which looks very similar to the bullfrog, except that it has that fold of skin extending from the back of the eye down to the hind leg. That's called a dorsolateral fold. And if you look back at the bullfrog, you see the bullfrog doesn't have that particular feature. So that's a good way to distinguish them. And this is the northern leopard frog. They also had some issues back in the 1960s and 70s, but then about 10 years after that, they bounced back. So, and they're doing pretty good right now. Again, they don't have they have a much longer life cycle than the cricket frog. So, which might be one reason why they seem to bounce back better. This is a wood frog. This is a eastern deciduous forest species. This again is not found in very many places in Cook County, Illinois, and even Lake County, Indiana. It's not really common. But once you get it into the wooded areas of Porter County and LaPorte County, these become very common. And then this is the pickerel frog. This is found in very few areas of the Calumet region. We have specimens of this that were collected in the Field Museum around 1915 in Porter County near the Bailey Homestead area, but they seem to have disappeared. And then you can just get a look at the variation in the in tadpoles or frog larvae. And they actually can be pretty easy to tell apart once you learn their different characteristics. Okay, now we're starting with the reptiles. We don't have many species of lizard. Probably our most common one is the six-lined race runner. And just about any sandy, open sandy area will have these. You know, people told me they used to occur in sandy areas on the embankments of the Indiana Toll Road. I've seen them outside the East Chicago South Shore train station through the window. So any kind of open sandy area, even if it's disturbed, will chances are will harbor these animals. Once the area starts getting thickly vegetated and the open sand starts disappearing, then these will disappear too. So they seem to like areas that have some disturbance that keeps the sandy areas open. And then this is the five-lined skink. This is an animal that was really rare in the Calumet. Up until 10 years ago, there was only one record of this animal from about 1900 in the Miller area of Gary. And it was collected and put in a museum collection. So we know, but bird watchers have been finding this animal, more regularly in areas along Lake Michigan, even areas that like railroad right-of-ways that are very disturbed. And we're getting more reports of this animal from down along the Kankakee River at near Sumava resorts and areas like that, Schneider. So this one species that I guess that we're just getting better at finding them than we were, 50 years ago. And then we have one lizard that is completely legless, and it's called the glass lizard. It's superficially looks like a snake, but it has movable eyelids. Along the side of the body, it has a lateral groove, which snakes don't have. And then there are very many skeletal differences that distinguish them from snakes. And then a lot of different turtles. The spiny softshell turtle is found in Wolf Lake and many other permanent wetland areas. And they get really large. They look like when they're out basking on a log, they look like a gigantic pancake just sitting there in the sun. Everyone's familiar with the eastern snapping turtle. And these are still doing pretty well in the area. The common map turtle is a little more unusual, but it's more characteristic of larger streams and rivers. Called the map turtle because you can't really tell on this one, but on the shell of some of them, they have a very pretty kind of map-like pattern. And then the painted turtle, which is pretty much found throughout the Calumet. There's an interesting way of telling the males from the females in painted and red-eared turtles. If you look at the topmost photo that shows the long claws on the turtle, that is the long claws are characteristics of the males. The males will, when they're mating the female in water, they will swim in front of her, but they swim backwards. They swim in reverse, and they usually have the legs and those long claws on the sides of the female's head, and they're wiggling those long claws as some sort of a courtship. And then this is the spotted turtle. It's a state endangered species. We're lucky enough that we do have decent populations of this turtle, in certain areas of the Calumet region. It's, they do get, since they're very pretty turtles, they get poached for the pet trade. So that's one thing that anyone who studies spotted turtles tries to keep the places where they occur secret, so people don't get in there and start taking them. There was a population of these up in, I think, Michigan, that's scientists had been studying for years. And the poachers got into the site and they caught just about every one of them he had and destroyed his whole study. And then this is a state endangered Blanding's turtle. These are aquatic turtles. They live in wetlands. They do come out to bask on logs with the painteds and the snappers. And the way you can distinguish these is if you're looking at a log full of turtles that are basking, if you see one that has a banana yellow chin and throat, that's a Blanding's turtle. They stick out like a sore thumb when they're basking. And they have very long necks, so they're very distinctive. And it's always a treat to find one. And then the red-eared slider. This is the pet shop turtle that was commonly sold in shops from the 20s up until, I guess, the 70s, when it was made illegal to sell them because of the salmonella problem. But our populations in the Calumet region are probably red-eared turtles that occurred here naturally, and then a lot of pet turtles that were released or flushed down the toilet or thrown into ponds and rivers that were unwanted pets. This is the musk turtle. They call the musk turtle because they have kind of a bad odor. They're an aquatic turtle, spend most of their time in wetlands. These are common in Wolf Lake. We were out in Wolf Lake, just kind of I think we were looking for cricket frog, the elusive cricket frogs, and we passed by a large pile of mulch that I guess the parks or the city dumped out there maybe to put on the trails. And there was a female musk turtle on top of one of these big mounds. It was like about 5 feet above ground level. And she was digging a nest in the top of that wood chip pile. And then the eastern box turtle. This again is an eastern deciduous forest species, and not common at all in Lake County. There's a few populations, or in Cook County, I mean. I don't think it's ever occurred there naturally. Lake County, there's a few populations, but then when you get into the Indiana Dunes and wooded areas in Porter County, they become more common. And you can tell the sex of box turtles by the color of their eyes. The males, like this one, are usually brighter colored with more yellow and orange on the head. And they also have red eyes, whereas the females have brown eyes. And there's other ways to tell the sex too, but that's kind of a fun way of distinguishing them. And it's called the box turtle because it has a flexible hinge on its lower shell or plastron, so it can pull its head and limbs and tail in and close up just like a box. And it makes it a little harder for predators to get after the soft part of the turtle. Although a coyote or a dog that's really persistent can do quite a bit of damage to the shell of these turtles. Okay, then we have the snakes. This is a blue racer. These snakes like large territories, so they need pretty large areas of decent habitats. Super common in the Indiana Dunes. They like open, sunny, sandy areas. The hognose snake, which tries to threaten you by flattening its head to make its head look bigger, flattening its body for the same reason. They will bluff by opening their mouth and giving you the look like the one in the lower photo. But if that doesn't scare you away, they will flip over on their back, open their mouth, curl their tail into a circle and play dead. And these are very particular in their diet. They only eat frogs and toads. Eastern milk snake, pretty common throughout the Calumet in open, in prairie areas as well as forested areas. They are very common in areas that are disturbed by man. I've found these out near the Bailey homestead. They're called the milk snake because they hang out in barns where they can eat rodents. And back in the old days, farmers would often blame the milk snake if the cow started giving less milk, thinking that the snakes were actually milking the cows, which is physically impossible. But it's one of those old folk tales that have pretty much died out, as we become less of an agricultural society. And then the western fox snake looks very similar to the milk snake. These are good sized snakes. They'll get 4 feet long, and when they are disturbed, they will actually vibrate the tip of their tail. So if they're sitting in dry leaves, they almost make a rattlesnake-like sound. And then this is the eastern rat snake. This is a eastern deciduous forest species. Not super common in Porter County, but as you get over into LaPorte County, into the nicely wooded areas, these snakes occur there, and they get big. They'll get up to about 6 feet long, and they spend a lot of the times in trees, or if they can get into old sheds and buildings, they'll be up in the rafters. The northern water snake, pretty much the one mystery about Wolf Lake is why there are northern water snakes there. It doesn't make sense. Not too far away in near the Gary Airport area, there's water snakes all over the place. There's water snakes in the Grand Calumet as well as the Little Calumet River. But it would seem like Wolf Lake would be a perfect place for these things, but nobody that I know has ever found a water snake in Wolf Lake. And the smooth green snake is, as you can tell by the color of the snake, is a prairie species. Lives in, blends right in with the grass. These are insect feeders, and they're state endangered species. Since they're a prairie species, and we don't have a lot of prairie in Indiana, they just, their distribution in Indiana isn't great. And this is another water snake called the queen snake, and they spend time along the rivers. They have a very unusual diet in that the only thing they eat are freshly shed crayfish. And they're freshly shed crayfish are very soft, so they're easy for the snake to consume. I don't think it could really handle a hard-shelled crayfish, but they're a pretty interesting species. And then the northern ringneck snake. These are another mysterious species in the Calumet region. There's only, oh gosh, maybe like 4 or 5 reports of these and all of them are from the Indiana Dunes National Park. But they're a small species. They're only about 1 foot long, and they seem to specialize on eating salamanders. So anywhere where there's redback salamanders, which is a lot of the wooded areas in Porter County, you would think that these snakes would be pretty common, but they're not. If you go further south in Indiana to Turkey Run and Park County and the same in Illinois, these are very common snakes. You can go out snake hunting and find, 6 of them pretty easily, but not in the Calumet. And this is the Midland brown snake. They, again, are a small species. They get to be maybe about 1 foot long. A good place to observe these is Oak Ridge Prairie County Park. especially in the fall, if you take the entrance road, especially if you're on a bike, these things just sit stretched out on the road, basking in the sun, getting ready, to hibernate for the winter. And then this is a relative of the northern brown snake called the red-bellied snake. And again, a good place to find these is the main road at Oak Ridge Prairie on those Indian summer days. And then we have several species of garter snakes, some garter snakes that are longer and thinner than a typical garter snake are called the ribbon snakes. And we have two types. We have the Western ribbon, and really a pretty snake with that orange stripe going down the middle of the back. And then we have the Eastern ribbon snake that is more characteristic of the eastern areas of the Calumet. But these also, both of them also occur down at Jasper Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area. And then we have the two garter snakes. We have the plains garter snake. Again, this is more associated with the eastern prairie or the western prairie areas. So super common in Cook County and the south side of Chicago. Getting rarer as you move into Lake County, and in Porter County, I've only found them in one site outside of Valparaiso, and apparently there's one record in LaPorte County where these were found, maybe in the 1950s. And then you have to go all the way to Ohio, where there's a pocket of prairie habitat left over from the Pleistocene period, where another population of the plains garter snake occurs. And then the eastern garter snake is pretty much found throughout the whole Calumet region, whether it's wooded or man-altered habitat or prairie. They like it all. And then the Kirtland snake is a state endangered species. These unfortunately are not very common. There was a site along 41 near, if you're familiar with as Stan's Junkyard was, there was a prairie remnant across from there where these occurred, and smooth green snakes, which are state endangered species. And unfortunately, about 7 years ago, that site was just turned into a subdivision. So these, which is to me was just a horrible waste. And that the state or some local conservation group didn't buy up the land, to protect these snakes. But and they were actually pretty common at that site too, which even makes me sadder. And then we have one venomous species in the Calumet, and that's called the Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. And those have become very rare. Used to be quite a number of them in the Indiana dunes, but unfortunately, something happened where they just kind of disappeared. I think the habitat changed from more open to more wooded. Rattlesnakes are always exterminated, wherever they occur. So, but I would think there's probably some individuals left in the Indiana Dunes State Park or other areas of the National Lakeshore. If you go out to LaPorte County and further east in Indiana, these snakes do become a little bit more common. And I think we're finally at the end. So sorry for taking up so much of your time, but if anyone has any questions, please, please ask them.
I want to ask if there are any sightings of wood frogs, Butler's garter snakes, and bull snakes in the Calumet area.
Well, though the wood frogs are in Lake County, there's only one site where they were found, and it's just off Route 30, right near the Porter County line. But if you get into the Indiana Dunes and the more wet wood areas and wooded areas around Valparaiso, the wood frogs are pretty easy to find. And if you get over into LaPorte County, there are places you go in the late summer after the wood frogs have metamorphosed, and where you have to watch where you step so you don't step on them. So they're one of those animals that becomes much more common as you go east. Now, there are records from the bull snake. Traditionally, the bull snake was found just south of the Grand Kankakee Marsh. But as we know, at the early part of the last century, the river was channelized and that whole marsh was destroyed. And that marsh at one time, I think, was kind of a barrier to the bull snakes coming north. But I think after the river was channelized and there were, train tracks and bridges put over the river, maybe the snakes have managed to move north in the last century, or they were always here as far as the bull snakes. But I actually found a bull snake myself in Lake Station. And I know another one was found by a fella that worked at Bethlehem, with the former Bethlehem Steel. He was getting out of work one night and found one on the road. And then another fella that worked for the Indiana DNR in the 1980s found one out at Hoosier Prairie. So there's, but those are the only records I know of from, in Indiana, north of the Kankakee. But that, and then what was the other one you asked about?
Butler's
Oh, the
garter
butlers. Yeah, gosh, I had never seen a butlers in my life until we went up to Milwaukee. We took our dog up there to see a special vet. And while the dog was getting examined by the vet, we stopped at a small park in Milwaukee, and it must have been the day when the Butler's garter snakes were coming out of hibernation, because we saw 7 or 8 of them. But there are no Butler's records, from the Calumet. And even from northeastern Illinois, it's not until you get up to the Milwaukee area that you get them. But if you go down to around Kokomo, Indiana, that's I think where some of our last records were. But people have been looking for them down in Kokomo, but have so far have not found the Butler's garter snake. And Sherman Minton, who was he was the godfather of Indiana herpetology. He passed away about 20 years ago, but he characterized the Butler's garter snake as a junkyard snake, where most of the sites in Indiana where they were found were junkyards. So they're another garter snake that doesn't mind altered habitats. But just for some reason we've not found them in decades in Indiana, and it's not from lack of trying. I've gone down to Kokomo just driving the roads in the fall when snakes are moving, in the hopes of finding one on a road, and didn't have any luck. But that's a nice about those. Those are those are one of the more unusual garter snakes in our area.
Which reptiles and amphibians have recovered in the Calumet region?
Well, I think the cricket frog, I don't know if it's recovered or if they've just kind of hung on in places, because so far we found them at the Gary Airport area. We did know of them at Wolf Lake, and then as you go further east into LaPorte County, for a while there, my wife Donna and I were on Friday nights after work. We would plan our route based on wetlands that we would find on topo maps and the Indiana wetlands, or the National Wetlands Inventory maps. We would find particular wetlands, and then we would go visit them. And then I would have my dog clicker with me, And we found several sites, where they had not been reported from before. But again, people had probably never looked for them at those sites before, especially using the secret weapon with the dog training clicker. But it seems the Massasauga, why it's not more frequent in the dunes is a mystery. And there was a population in Crete, Illinois, a very big population that was, studied. They knew almost exactly how many snakes were there. They knew what, the burrows that the snakes were living in. And that whole population within like 10 years just disappeared.
Yeah, Alan, just from the chat, Laura wants to know if you said there were no wood frogs in Cook County?
I don't think there are. No, there might be one population at the same site where there's where the redback salamander was located, but so there's either one or no sites in Cook County where the wood frogs are at. Let's see. When we were Boy Scouts, whatever you were, and Scouts 11 or 12 years old, we had a camping trip at, I forget the name of it, Xander's Woods maybe, and we found wood frogs there when we were little Cub Scouts. We didn't know anything about collecting a specimen or taking a photograph, but we did find wood frogs there because we'd be running through the woods, finding these frogs, and we knew enough about amphibians and reptiles, from reading books and stuff, that they were wood frogs. So they were there at one time, but they, that nobody has found them there, since. But we found quite a number of them.
Thanks. Yeah, that's interesting. I thought I saw one at Bobian Woods, but I was probably mistaken.
Yeah, I don't think they'd be at Bobian, but sometimes the green frogs are, look kind of like a wood frog. But yeah, the wood frogs seem to really like the wetter woods with the fishless vernal ponds in them. So Bobian probably is a neat place, but it probably wouldn't have the wood frog out there. But
Yeah.
Is it possible to find a Graham's crayfish snake anywhere in the Calumet?
They've never been found in Indiana. So they've so that's, probably with the destruction of wetland areas that that would tend to favor them. I would say they probably won't be found in Indiana. Not to saying they didn't occur here in pre-settlement times, but they've never been reported in Indiana, unfortunately. But it'd be nice if someone could find them.
And what about Jefferson salamander?
The Jefferson, well, we have the blue spotted, which is a relative of the Jeffersons. And then the polyploid salamander that, I showed, that is not a real species, but it's a hybrid. And it's thought to be, some of them are thought to be hybrids with Jefferson salamanders. But you have to go south to get the Jeffersons. Like the closest place I've found them is to Indiana, is down just near Turkey Run State Park. There's some areas down that, down towards Park County or probably Fountain County. But we've got the blue spotted, which, like I say, is very similar. And then there's a salamander I didn't mention called a smallmouth salamander. And somebody who lives in Porter County, just off Route 30, posted a picture of a salamander they found in their pool. And gosh, that thing looked like a smallmouth salamander. So and I mean, there is one smallmouth salamander record from southern Porter County. So I'd like to do a little more investigation, you know, around the Lake of the Four Seasons area and the Gavis Arboretum area to see, you know, if indeed smallmouth salamanders are actually there.
They are reintroductions of Blandings turtles in DuPage, Lake, and Will counties. But what about Cook County, especially in the Calumet area?
Yeah, you know, I haven't heard any of that going on. You know, I know, you know, they do occur in very small numbers at Powderhorn. And then probably in some parts of Wolf Lake. I remember finding, I was driving down, I think near that Sheffield trailer park, just on the, you know, it was like a kind of near in Hammond, North Hammond. And a Blandings turtle was crossing the road and some guys aimed for it and killed it. But I mean, that was living in, you know, some wetlands, you know, in that Wolf Lake area down there. So, you know, but I've not heard of anyone talking about reintroducing them. But
I have a question concerning the snakes. The snakes' food. How is it determined the diet of some of these very rare species, like soft-shell crayfish, as an example? How do we know? How do you know that?
well, you know, again, it goes back to the museum specimens. You know, once a reptile or an amphibian or any animal is caught for a museum or collection, it's humanely euthanized, and then it's preserved pretty quickly after. So everything that animal has eaten is also preserved. And then the museums will allow researchers and students to come in and study the animals. You know, and some student might want to look at what northern water snakes or queen snakes are eating. So it's, you know, a benefit of having these preserved animals in museums, you know, allow people to do more detailed study. And, you know, of course, you know, some of it could be observation too. You know, I've seen, you know, snakes feeding on things and turtles in the wild, but, you know, actually having the museum specimens where you can open up the stomach and, you know, measure, you know, the size of the crayfish and identify what species, you know, you get a lot more information than just a casual observation.
Thank you.
Sure. No, good questions.
I've heard that there's a stronghold of spotted turtle at Lake Station somewhere in Indiana in the Calumet area. And are there a few more strongholds of spotted turtles in the Calumet to make a recoverable population?
You know, I think, you know, the populations that I know of, you know, are in pretty good shape. That, you know, the problem is, you know, the possibility of poaching. And then another thing is I know one site that was a nice marshy area and has, you know, within 15 years turned into all Phragmites. So that I think that's going to shade the habitat too much for spotted turtles, you know, and they may, you know, start declining in numbers. So I think it's, you know, more habitat change, but as long as the habitat's taken care of and the, you know, invasives are kept out, then, you know, they should be able to do okay. You know, the box turtles, they're kind of in trouble and we're not sure why. They're becoming rare. You know, and they're, you know, and then the ranaviruses I was talking about earlier, that seems to affect turtles. And there was a site in Gary where I went one fall and just found a whole number of painted turtles that were sick. They were just, they're a turtle that spends most of their time in the water, and these were up in the shallows or up on land. Their eyes, they were blowing bubbles out of their noses, and their eyes were swollen, and they were lethargic. The one that I saw in the water was floating at an angle, which showed that it had fluid in one of its lungs, so it couldn't couldn't float like a turtle normally would. So it's and that's there have been people that have diagnosed ranavirus among box turtles, so it could have been possible that has moved through our population too. Well, plus the box turtles and Blanding's turtle nests are predated by, and just about any turtle net predated by mammalian predators. Like there's some populations of Blanding's turtles where they don't reproduce in a given year because all the eggs are destroyed. So you've got the old individuals can find each other and mate and lay eggs, but you're getting no young turtles, coming up through the ranks because, all the eggs are eaten.
How can the disease be prevented?
I don't know. Yeah, it's just one of those things that I guess is naturally occurring, but yeah, that I think there, at least for frogs, I think some people are looking into treating the frogs. And I guess, there probably some level of the disease is, possible, in any population. Like some of the endangered frog in Indiana called the crawfish frog, a certain population of those were tested, and a number of them were carrying the chytrid fungus. But, they luckily seem to be asymptomatic. So, but yeah, wildlife diseases are, just a hard thing to kind of, keep track of and diagnose. If nobody's out there doing observations or surveys, these animals can just die. It just happened to be I was out at that particular site near Gary where the sick turtles were at, but if I wouldn't have gone there that fall, I'd have never realized, that there would have been any problem. And, a lot of the painted turtles did survive too, because, the disease or, whatever it was that went through seems to have stopped. And other species of turtles that occurred at the site weren't affected. It was just the painteds.
Have you heard of a fungus that's making Massasauga rattlers sick?
Well, there's that fungus that's affecting, Massasaugas and other species of snake, where it causes skin problems, where their eyes become affected and their mouths, they get these crusty, scabby deposits all over the head and the body. Yeah, so that's a fairly new problem. But it's sad, we turn these areas into preserves and try to do our best to manage these species, and then just all these strange circumstances come out of left field to cause harm to them, in spite of our best efforts to keep their population strong.
Alan, can we just have one more question, and then
Sure.
We'll bring this to an end?
Sure.
Is there another question?
How can the Kirkland snake be recovered even though it's found in low numbers?
Yeah, that's a hard one, because ideally you would like they're doing with the Blanding's turtles, you would head start the young, But you need a good, you need to find a good population where you can get the adults from to bring them into captivity so they can breed, so that you can release, the head started young. But with the Kirtland snakes, other than that site I was talking about where they seem to be real common, in many places, they're not common. But, again, there's some sites like Indianapolis seems to be a hotbed of Kirtland snakes where, some of the best populations of Kirtland snakes in the world are, down in vacant lots, in Indy. Unfortunately, one of the best sites where there were just tons of Kirtland snakes was destroyed to make a bowling alley or something. But yeah, you need the healthy adult populations, to produce the young that you want to, head start and possibly release somewhere else.
All
And
right, Alan, thank you very much.
Oh gosh, well, thank you, Michael.
We all learned an awful lot, and so thanks so much. And you'll be around Wolf Lake again. I might run into you someday.
Yeah. But you'll be doing the Wetlands Festival, won't you?
Yeah.
So yeah. So, but if I don't see you there, maybe we can get together to go look for cricket frogs.
That's right. Exactly right.
Yeah.
Okay. And I want to thank everybody else for attending. We had a good crowd tonight, and I look forward to seeing you in September. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Bye.
Goodbye.
All right, adios.
Take care.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Wonderful.